Hey, Robyn.
And Robyn.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Not bad. You?
Surviving the bullshit.
Yeah.
Surviving the bullshit. We might have to call this episode that.
That's the heart of what we're all doing right now, I think.
Right on. Thanks to you guys for chatting with us today. Appreciate it.
And what is this going to be on?
That's a good question. So maybe this is a good place to start. Like a couple weeks ago, at kind of the height of all the outrage around the family separation stuff, I wrote to Preston and I said, hey, I think we need to, use whatever voice we have, whatever platform that we may have to say something about this, to speak against it. And, I admit that the initial impulse was sort of like a reactive one, but I think this sense of ethical repulsion is pretty widespread. And even though Trump has signed this executive order stopping the practice, even though it's just kind of kicking the can down the road, right? It's been a week or so since then, and I feel like maybe it's still important to discuss what's going on in the U.S. Politically, theologically, culturally, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to come to terms with my own thinking around this. My intuition is that there's legitimate cause for alarm about what's going on in the U.S. right now, where we all live. And so, I don't know, maybe we can just start with a really general question to get us started, and you guys can, take it in whatever direction you want. But, what do you think? How bad are things in the U.S. right now?
I mean, I guess I want to respond to a little bit of what you said as maybe a preface to the conversation.
Sure.
Which I think is actually, it's a really good place to start, because I think there are a lot of people reacting, and I think as a person of color, as a non-binary trans person, and as a queer person, this is not anything new to our communities, to the communities of which I am a part. But I know that it's new to maybe the dominant culture, that being white folks. And so I think there's a great opportunity actually for our communities to come together and to do some restorative and reparative work and really do some bridging and figure out what is a way forward for us to be human with one another. I've said in other places, we are failing to be human with one another. And if we don't figure out how to be human with one another, we will not survive ourselves. And so I want to hold the impulse to be reactionary with compassion, because I think righteous anger is something that is important in our shared traditions, whether it is a spiritual tradition or a cultural tradition or a religious tradition or what have you. Righteous anger is important, and we have to figure out how to be productive in the midst of a lot of pessimism. I'm not someone who necessarily believes that the system works for anyone, even though it seems to work for the dominant culture. I think what we realize is that when the system is working for some, it is not working for all, but it's really not really working for some. And so I think there's a chance for those of us who have public platforms to actually be generous with our critique and invite the deeper relational work of healing, and really addressing the woundedness that we all suffer from, and figure out a way forward. And so, there is a lot of reactionary stuff. I read it on Twitter all the time. And even, I tweeted the other day, even if we elect a Democratic majority, it doesn't heal the wounds, the open wounds that have been growing for centuries, right? We've not been able to deal with genocide, with shadow slavery, with Jim Crow, with the militarization of the police. And every empire is won over the theft of bodies and the theft of land. And so I think until we get to some of the root problems of the American empire, will we begin to figure out a way forward. And that's the deep relational work that I'm committed to in the work of activist theology. and building bridges across lines of radical difference, and feel very curious to be in conversation with y'all, right, to figure out what is a way forward.
Mm-hmm. That bridging work that you're talking about and having compassion for the other. I mean, I think that's this kind of language that resonates with people and people can get behind it, and being generous towards the other. But it seems to me that there's perhaps like a situation here where you're warning against kind of dehumanizing the other, but that's exactly what we're sort of up against.
Well, I mean, the American empire is built on the dehumanization of non-white people.
Mm-hmm.
That is true. And I think that, I mean, it may be that this American experiment is an utter failure at this point. I mean, it sort of seems like it is. And I feel curious about where are the points of connection, even in the midst of the vitriol that is being uttered from policymakers, from people in power. Because and Tad, I would be curious about some of your work around in the psychoanalytic realm, but I think we have to remember that even in the dehumanization, that subject who is dehumanizing the other is a victim of the dehumanization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To that point, I think that it's very difficult to think in terms of like some sort of drive where we're seeing people like very in the open enjoy just gratuitous sadism, right? And from a psychoanalytic perspective, there's an aspect of like what sadism wants to do is to provoke anxiety, right? Like it enjoys the anxiety of the other. And there's an element of that is masochistic as well, right? So I feel like what we're seeing with the sort of white supremacist, collective at this moment is not just an enjoyment of causing harm to those that it can exclude, but it's actually part of a drive to no one's place, right? And not to necessarily be on the top, but to just be above someone else, right? So like we see this all the time, I think, when people are protesting, even white people are like protesting against having access to healthcare or higher wages or something like that, right? So they can do that, and that's masochistic, right? Like that will lead to your own death, your own suffering in life. But the way that you justify that is to be gratuitously sadistic towards somebody else, to sort of draw your attention somewhere else. And I think that even maybe more to the point, it's kind of interesting to like in psychoanalytic terms, this structure of anytime you're uttering, yes, I know, but even so, like where there's this yes, I know acknowledgement, but then even so, I disavow this, right? That's called, perversion. And we're talking about a movement that's broadly neurotic in nature, right? Kind of like basically well-adjusted, normal, neurotic people who are increasingly having to rely on this perverse statement of, yes, I know things are awful, but even still, I'm going to pretend as if they're not. Or yes, I know this is ridiculous con artistry, but I'm going to pretend like it's the absolute truth, right? So we've got this whole, like, we can't, and it's difficult to have lines of communication open with the other when the whole sustenance of your worldview is predicated on this very kind of overt, out in the open perversion. This yes, I know, but even still doesn't matter, right? So that produces like another problem with even just having a conversation where the others need to harm themselves is predicated on their ability to harm another, and the lack of empathy we're seeing is actually a way to keep people from having to feel shame in the first place, right? So we can't even get to the point of shame, much less having like interpersonal conversations at this point, right?
You actually wrote something on social media that I've been sitting with. You wrote, just as a reminder, there's no shared society-wide concept of decency or the common good.
Oh yeah.
So appealing to standards your opponent don't share won't work. And I think that's maybe right. And I think that, like, as you say, more people are coming to terms with this idea that, like, ethical appeals, whether put forward in like religious or non-religious terms, maybe aren't going to work.
Right. Yeah.
And if that's really the case, where do we go from there? Like, what does that mean for us when we're trying to like mediate disputes, identify shared values? If there is no shared sense of the common good, where does this leave us?
Right. Yeah. That whole like ridiculous idea that we have some sort of shared common good, I think is just kind of flying out the window, right? Like it's plainly on the face of it wrong. Just as not everyone wants capitalism or not everyone wants socialism, not everyone wants to have healthcare or living wages. Not everyone wants everyone to have equal rights, right? We live in this perverse fantasy that we're just arguing over the details of how to get to the end goal. We don't have like a common end goal in the end of this. Right, the end goal for a lot of people is the continued oppression of lots of people. The end goal for some people is destroying the world and going extinct. Right, it wouldn't be able to articulate it that way. Right, like the fantasy keeps it, suppressed and inactive without their awareness. Right, but like the end goal with some people really is just destruction. Right, so we have solution.
I feel curious, Tad, because I think this is where your work is really, really interesting. I agree that we don't share a common goal, that there's no common good with which we are invested. But I think it is true to say that we all share in the inhumanity of one another. Mm-hmm. And if that is true, is it even possible to wake up from our shared inhumanity so that we can actually be in relationship to build a common goal or to invest in the common good? And this is where I think both of our training in theology actually points toward sort of an eschatological horizon. For me, as a liberationist, toward collective liberation, and maybe you, so that we're not all repressed, right?
Sure. Yeah, when you're saying that, it makes me think back to, I teach college as an affiliate faculty member at several community colleges here, right? And even just getting students right now to kind of get to the idea that we don't have like shared sets of ethics or shared like desires in the world, like even just getting students to that point is hard enough, right? And then I don't know, when you were talking earlier about just kind of like the way that maybe broader culture is kind of waking up to what people of color have like been dealing with for forever. It reminded me of like a recent interaction I had a couple weeks ago where one of my students, a white student, she's very brilliant. She's very on top of things, but this happens from time to time where a student will make a comment like, in America, we have like equal opportunities and et cetera, and a person of color next to her said, well, except for the concentration camps, right? And it was kind of like it was that moment, like the entry of the real, where you get to say like, no, actually things are like awful, and it's not just that we like are all wanting to hurt the other. It's like that like I guess what you were talking about, like our shared inhumanity is like part of that shared inhumanity is like the inability to even see that we have something that we're doing that's inhuman in the first place, right? Yeah, so. But yeah, like I don't want to go on too long on that, but
no. I mean, I think it's a thing that continues to compel me is the work of Latin American liberation theology, in particular John Sobrino's work on, when he finished both his engineering degree in St. Louis, Missouri, and his doctorate from Germany. When he returned to El Salvador, he woke up from the inhumanity because he saw the poor. And so I have a question about how do we facilitate that waking up? I think that at heart of the work that I'm doing in the Activist Theology Project is both the work of helping people wake up to the inhumanity of things and also facilitating connection and belonging. Not necessarily in a religious community, but really addressing the poverty of connection that we have in this world that is perpetuated by capitalism and war culture and all the other things that we're fighting against. But I feel curious about, like, for John Sobrino, when he returned to El Salvador, he woke up from the inhumanity. And for him as a theologian, because theology deals with the sort of big questions in life, he had ascribed to a narrative that for him facilitated the waking up. But if we are all sort of post-Christian, or we check the none box on religious affiliation, what is it that facilitates our waking up from a shared inhumanity? I think that's a driving question that I have, especially in this moment where everybody is lodging reactionary comments and sort of shaming everything.
Yeah, I would say that would be one of the problems with what's going on right now, is that we don't have a shared eschatological horizon, because I think a lot of people are checking the none box, right? And even within the churches, or even within religious institutions, I don't think there's a shared eschatological horizon. I think, like Tad was saying, there are some people who maybe there's this, I don't know what state he's running for, but there's this guy running for like a state house that is saying that God is a white supremacist and a racist, basically. So, and he's using the Bible to justify it. So I'm saying, even within the church, like, there are people who have different, I know you're aware of this, Robyn. I don't mean to, like, I'm not trying to teach you anything new here.
No. Yeah.
Yeah. But I just think that, like, even within the religious institutions and then these post-Christian communities, I think that there's a lack of a shared narrative, like you're saying. So, and I don't know if there's a desire to maybe go back to a shared narrative, even though, I mean, there might be, there certainly could be. It's just a matter of, like you're saying, formulating that and coming to terms with that, and trying to share that. And I think a lot of that work is face-to-face work, community work, like you're doing. But I don't see it. And I think that could be an explanatory point as to why people are being more reactive now, because we don't have a narrative or a framework to understand what's going on or what to do about it.
Well, and religious violence is a real thing. Christian
Right.
supremacy. The reality is, and I've said this in a lot of different places. I'll say it here again because I think it's worth saying. The parasitic relationship that is shared between white supremacy and Christian supremacy, that produces, like, the exportation of violence and homophobia and all the other things to the global South, is something that is very real. And what results in that, at least here in this country, is spiritual violence or religious violence at the hands of people like Jeff Sessions, or, well, Sarah Huckabee, talking about Romans 13 and actually proof texting that passage and not finishing the rest of the passage. And so I feel curious about, if we don't have a shared narrative, what we do have is a shared experience of religious violence and religious trauma. And so how do we actually facilitate healing from that place when I feel like, and Tad, I would be curious about your response to this, what most of what we're doing is filtering through the religious trauma, the religious violence, and then lodging the same logic, right? Like, using the same logic of religious violence, maybe it has a different name, to who we understand as oppressors or those in power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My current research project is all about the types of fantasy that we see in white evangelicalism. And, I'm trying to look at certain historical trends, like the resistance to knowledge or science or something like that, and kind of show how we can't really talk about that unless we're also talking about the history of education after the Civil War and resistance to school immigration and all these things that are essentially anti-black at their core. Anti-blackness is the thing that tethers white evangelical. And so I am really interested in the way that these types of fantasies get deployed, because, like, in psychoanalysis, fantasy is that which allows us to enjoy when we can't accept reality as such, right? So the way that we're talking about, like, religious teleology here, that's a type of fantasy that can work if we're all on the same page. We're probably not going to be on the same page anytime soon, right?
Right.
And that's kind of like where there's sort of like this appeal to, like, maybe we can talk about, maybe it's helpful to talk about like love in Christian terms or judgment, right, in prophetic terms. And maybe that's helpful, right? Like that might be like the kind of, in the same way that a joke kind of bypasses defense mechanisms, maybe that helps pull some people along, right? But at the end of the day, I think that what we're really dealing with is so many fantasies, and I don't just mean the right. It's probably more active on the right, but on the middle and left too. These fantasies that are essentially keeping us from feeling shame, right? They're kind of keeping us in this perpetual state of anxiety. And then I kind of think of like anxiety as like a middle ground between indifference on the one hand and shame on the other, right? Because shame and indifference can manifest, they're worlds apart in affect, but they can manifest the same. Like when I feel shame, I just kind of shut down. I don't want to defend myself. I don't want to be seen by the world. I just, I close down, right? Now, if I feel indifferent about something, I might just not say anything either, right? Like, so they can kind of manifest the same. And it's when we have this anxiety in the middle that we're jumping to criticize and defend and, get angry about things or whatever. So we're living in like this state of anxiety, and actually maybe like using sort of fantasy language or theological language might actually help us push towards the direction of actually feeling a bit of shame or a little bit of guilt or a little bit of sadness about the way that things are, right? Because like such a big problem right now is that the kind of like gratuitous cruelty again that we're seeing is an act of provoking anxiety, right? Like it's an act of keeping people from feeling shame about putting children in concentration camps, right? So like I don't know, I like that. I think Robyn's probably has like a lot more to say about that, because like the only way that I'm sort of trying to activate these kinds of affects that might install like a sense of guilt or shame or awareness of what's going on is in the classroom. And there's certain limits about what I can say in the classroom without losing my position, right? Which is a whole different like other conversation about like how to resist, right? But Robyn's like in a position where you have a whole different set of circumstances under which you get to talk about these things. So I don't know like what kind of experience you've had with activating that type of fantasy language to kind of bypass these defense mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is really helpful actually, just for people to have access to the framework and the thinking that both of us are invested in as scholars. I think that it is true that when we talk about collective liberation, it is a fantasy. That is true. And I feel like it also provokes people to maybe have an imagination around social practices or ethics, that if we actually live differently, we can achieve this other thing. And that is probably anxiety producing. It moves us into a place of anxiety where we are neither indifferent to what's happening in the world, nor do we engage in the shame or the guilt. I think it's also true that that anxiety can be productive. It can help to move us in a direction to facilitate change. And so I don't want to demonize anxiety. Hell, many of us take antidepressants to deal with our anxiety, because the buzz of what's happening in the world creates a sort of orientation to anxiety and despair. And because we are so fragmented in our communities and don't have connection and belonging, we often find it futile to resist. So many people don't go to protests because they're like, what is that going to do? What's the end result going to be? Is this really going to change something? I think that statement stems from anxiety, and the anxiety of like, this is not really doing anything, so I'm just going to stay home. In the same way, people who would call themselves public theologians, who are just writing op-eds for the New York Times or whatever, and actually not doing anything on the ground or doing the relational work to help assuage the anxiety and to help us move from a place of indifference and shame, is also not doing anything, right? So we're in this very peculiar moment where I really think it's the deep relational work, and probably, I think everybody should be in therapy, and everybody should be meeting with their therapist every week, and I don't care what branch of psychotherapy you're doing, but you should just be in something to help you talk through what's happening and to get to some of the roots of the anxiety so that we can sort of wake up from our inhumanity is my thought.
Yeah, I don't know. One thing I've been thinking about a lot is for like one of the sections of the book that I'm working on is Hannah Arendt's claim that once you get to the point of the camps, then you cease to need propaganda altogether. And what you need at that point, the state needs to instill just straight indoctrination, right? And so I think that we're kind of like getting perilously close to this point where we're not going to even be able to have conversations realistically, at least not me, like in a school, right? Like there's going to be more and more limits on like what I can or cannot say in class without having pushback from students that could cost me my job or something like that, right? So that's kind of like one example of how that might work for me. But yeah, like this question of like how do you well, I don't know. I wanted to also say something back to this this thing that Robyn was saying about like the usefulness of anxiety is like, yeah, like anxiety is like an actually it's the affect of all affects, right? Like it's something that can generate motion, right? It's the question of like what does the other want of me, and it's what do I want of the other, and it can collapse you into non-motion, into just being overwhelmed altogether, right? But it can be the very thing that causes you to make a change as well, right? So this is why, I always talk about like how Tillich talks about the way that religious rituals channel anxiety into, it takes all the different anxieties that are in the room and channels it into some sort of productive capacity, like with the Eucharist or something like that, right? So I'm wondering what it would mean to think of channeling that into something like a protest, right? Like how does like a protest that doesn't actually do anything in the moment, not just signal to the elites that there's popular unrest, but perhaps I don't know. For me, I was kind of thinking like when I go to a protest, I know that I also have family members who are posting status updates about how they hope the protesters get overrun that day, right? Like literally have family members hoping that I get killed, right? So and that's not abnormal. Like that's a normal thing that I know is happening every time I'm out there, right? So like, I mean, to me, maybe thinking about like sort of anxiety, like channeled into some sort of productive collective motion might just be the thing that at some point someone says, hey, maybe I'm not okay with wishing that my friends or family members get run over, or something like it can produce a certain spectacle that kind of says, hey, maybe this is too much. Maybe I need to kind of reconsider some of my my kind of indifference here, and be a bit worried about what's going on. So I don't know. Yeah, that's
I mean, I feel like what's so helpful about using the framework of psychoanalysis is that we, in many respects, we are, in the language of Kristeva, we are divided subjects.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that fragmentation, because of those divisions, which are multiplicitous, we are unable to have a coherent psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And that causes a lot of social unrest and civic unrest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think religion is one of those. So I think religion is a colonial tool. We have empire religion, and the anxiety that comes from empire religion produces the divisions within the psyche, and is almost the consequence of adhering to a sort of religious narrative is a turn toward God as the ultimate object that tries to solidify or cohere our psyche, and that makes us sick. That makes us psychologically sick, I think, which may piss off people that I say that, but I think it does. I think it makes us psychologically sick.
Yeah, well, at the very least, we can think of if the unconscious is structured like a language, right? Like if the sort of non-intentional sort of baseline who we are is the amalgamation of all these experiences and biases and privileges and various other things that are sort of inculcated in us, then the ego is that which is always defending us, right? Like it's always springing to fantasies to think about like how I'm a good person, even though I have all these weird impulses that I'm feeling brewing up, right? And so like I think religion, so like that's kind of where psychoanalysis says that the ego springs out of error, right? Like it's always making mistakes and misjudgments, and it's always creating fantasies to kind of justify itself under the weight of like superego and unconscious and id, right? So like the ego is always trying to justify itself. It's always constructing its whole worldview out of error, and that's where fantasy comes, right? Like and that's where religion springs too, right? Like religion is a fantasy. It's an imaginary register tool. And that doesn't mean it's bad. Like, it doesn't mean it's not useful. It is useful, but we need to be real about what it is. And so, so religion can be the way that we sort of activate these affects that need to be activated in order for people to feel something other than indifference. But it can also, if it's not used in the correct way, it can be the very same thing that becomes like, well, again, Romans 13 says we should just be okay with all this, right? So either way, the ego is trying to defend itself either way, right? Like so hopefully that we can use the ego's manifestations of error to produce something that's actually a little bit helpful along the way.
Right. Yeah. Which I think is found in story, right? That if we can figure out how to do storytelling in a way and share in that experience, we both we both sort of stabilize the ego and build connection, not based in ego, but based in a sort of emotional experience that stabilizes also the anxiety and might compel us into a shared common narrative.
That seems to connect back to something we were talking about earlier with the idea of eschatological trajectory. I mean, story can do that, right? And so I'm thinking about reading that alongside of religion. I mean, it has beneficial properties and not so beneficial properties. It's kind of pharmacon, right? So you still end up within, interpretation, representation, and so on. I think it's sort of ineluctable. But anyway, I wanted to ask you guys what you think about what's the role of the economy? Because 2008 happened, and there are real economic, fears, paranoias that I think maybe are being expressed different ways. So whether it's like, migrants who are coming to steal our jobs, which is an old trope, or how international, trade deals are very unfair. I've been hearing a lot more of the welfare queen myth lately. These narratives have been around for a long time, but you add in the real economic fragility.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it kind of gives these tropes a new energy. I don't know. How do you guys think about what role the economy is playing in all of this, or not?
I don't know that we can separate economy out from anything else, right? And so I understand the question, and also I want to say the question must be asked differently.
Okay.
Because the economy in a globalized network of capitalism, we cannot siphon out the economy as a thing that resides on its own. Although it does seem to have particular impact or consequences. I think the economy is also one of the things that provokes anxiety. Living in this time, the economy, or our uncertainty about the economy is causing lots of different migratory paths for people, right? So we have to deal with movement of people, and uncertainty, and the fear and anxiety that the economy brings, which I just don't know what to do with it. So I'm happy, Tad, for you to give a much more substantive answer.
I don't know. I'll take a stab at things. Yeah, well, the first thing I think is the, as far as you're talking about with the inability to disconnect it from anything else. Yes, of course, right. Yeah, that's Marx's axiom that it's not our consciousness that determines our form of life. It's our form of life that determines our consciousness, right? And I think of this in terms of like when I'm teaching kind of basic theories of capitalism with my students, like it's really difficult to get even students to even articulate what capitalism is, right? Like when I have that first conversation with my students, what is capitalism? Every single time, like, what do they do? Like, everyone jumps to things like either freedom and democracy, things that aren't economic categories, right? They like jump completely past economy, or they talk about like trade, entrepreneurialism, like various things that aren't distinctly capitalist in and of themselves. They're just kind of the basic like qualifiers of having a market that can also exist in communism, right? So like the even idea of like what even is this thing, and then like once you get to students to start articulating concepts like surplus value or exploitation or the various other things that we would talk about in our strands of work, at that point you still have the fantasy of like, but I could be a millionaire one day, right? Mm-hmm. Even if you tell students like 99% of you will live, like be born, live, and die in the same class, there's still this fantasy of like, yeah, but things can't be different because like, what if it goes really well for me? Even though it's much more likely that things will go really quite poorly, right? So we have all of this, all these kinds of fantasies, and we're only like barely in America, at least, even starting to get over like Red Scare era, where we can even say anything critical about the economy, right? Or about capitalism as such, right? And we live in this dangerous time. Like the millennials are not doing well, right? Like we are suffering a lot. My parents, when they were working for like $1.70 an hour in their high school job at like McDonald's or whatever, we're making a wage that adjusted for inflation and cost of living is $15 an hour today, right? I'm a professor. I make about $12 an hour, right? Like they were literally making more than like in their restaurant job than many millennials make today with graduate degrees. Right. So like there was an enormous amount of crisis, and there's a sense that like capitalism should be working and it's being mismanaged, right? Like, and it's very difficult to get people even on board with the idea that no, like that it's doing exactly what it's designed to do, right? There's nothing wrong with capitalism. It's working perfectly right now. And then you tack on to that like this border issue and thinking about migration and labor, and we end up fetishizing things like building a bigger wall as if that's going to work, right? Mm-hmm. The history of borders tells us that borders always like never ever do one thing, and that's keep people out, right? Like just however far back you want to go. You can talk about the U.S.-Mexico border, but you can talk about Hadrian's Wall, the Great Wall of China, or Neolithic fencing. Borders don't keep people out, right? So we're choosing to what borders do is they create like regulatory structures where we can tax goods at borders, or we can de-status people and create an abusable source of labor, right? So like that's what a border does. And so a border is also doing exactly what it's meant to do, right? If it's not keeping people out, it's doing exactly what it's meant to do, is to create like a labor force that we can abuse. So like there's all these ideas that like, okay, yeah, like the economy is creating all sorts of chaos, but it's doing just what it's supposed to do. Just like the Trump administration is doing just what it wants to do, just like the border is doing just what it means to do, right? And so it's that our fantasies are not aligned with the actual intention of these regimes of power in the first place. That's the problem.
Ted, I feel curious about two things. One is I totally agree with your analysis around what borders do and the function thereof. Does this also, do you think, contribute to the deep slumber of our inhumanity? That if nations are built through the theft of bodies and the theft of land, is that a condition that creates the slumber to inhumanity? And in our borders the same thing, another condition of the slumber of inhumanity? I feel curious about that. And then the other question I had is, if this is true, which I think it is, that borders are doing exactly what they're designed to do, which is to de-status people and mark people, keep people out or whatnot, or create a labor force. What is the relational work that we can be doing that helps to destabilize that fantasy so that we can come to share in a togetherness. How can we create conditions for connection and belonging?
Yeah. Oh, that's there's so much there. I don't even know if I have much I feel like you know way more about that first question because the first question kind of like I jumped to, we de-status people in a very specific way in America. That's definitely has analogs going back at least a few hundred years, but before the rise of the nation state, the way that nations are created as far as expropriating people, it works a different way than sort of after the breakup of the gradual decline of the Holy Roman Empire and the splitting up of Europe and colonial period and everything. So I don't even know that I have much to. I feel like you probably have a lot more to say on that than I would. To the second point, I can at least say that I find that, and of course I'm partly on this talking about the border, I'm drawing from Thomas Nail's recent book, Theory of the Border, that I think is really helpful for people to get their mind about what a border even is and what it's supposed to do. But I feel like when I talk about the concept of a border in class, I notice especially my students who I know are undocumented, seem to find a lot of I just see a lot of nodding along, oh yeah, okay, and now I get that. I have seen that, right? It makes sense that a border is doing what it's supposed to do if it's destatissing me and terrorizing me, right? So even just kind of putting it in very stark terms of there are two sides to this issue, sure, but they're not should we have stronger borders or weaker borders? It's do we want to keep destatissing people and terrorizing people or not, right? So I think just putting it in really stark terms, I feel is at least helpful because I see some students kind of nod along and enjoy it and want to ask more questions, and then I see the students who I know are not with me on that kind of get a little squeamish and a little concerned and kind of definitely uncomfortable. And I think that lack of comfort when we're talking about just in very plain terms about terrorizing people is a good thing for students to feel as well. I don't know if you had more to say on the first question or not. But
I love Thomas Nail's work. That's Frida, if you're seeing her.
Hey, Frida.
Frida is my ghostwriter, I like to say. So I love Thomas's work, and I also look to people like Gloria Zadua who looked at borders and the borderlands as an open wound, and is trying to excavate some of the relational impact of what borders do. And there are all types of borders that we can think about, not just nation-state borders. But I feel curious about, my work these days in the public square has primarily been the deep relational work of naming the woundedness and trying to facilitate connection and belonging. And so, I feel really curious about the relational piece. And as much as I am a theory junkie and love reading high theory, I would say 98% of people are not going to pick up a book and slog through theory.
Sure.
I feel curious about the relational work. And I want us to be committed to the deep relational work that is not so much about reconciling our differences, but restoring our shared humanity and figuring out how to survive each other. Because I think civil war is a real thing that could happen. Mm-hmm. And that would just be another fold in our war culture. So, I bring to the table the question of restoring our humanity and figuring out how to share life together. And how do we do that?
Yeah, there's just so many things kind of rushing through my mind right now. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is so complicated, so multifaceted. all these issues are interrelated, you know, theologically, politically, culturally, all these different, historically, all these things. And I think it can be overwhelmingly complicated, which has this sort of incapacitating effect where we just keep wringing our hands, you know, and so like just on a political level, I just wonder if it might be helpful to be a little bit reductive, because you talked about the possibility of civil war. People are talking about it. I hear about it. I posted something the other day about guillotines.
Yeah.
But I think there's a case that could be made that a war is already being waged against poor people and people of color. And like instead of grabbing the nearest pitchfork or going out in the garage and start building guillotines, you know, like, which is tempting.
Yeah.
Like, is it what do we do beyond the relational stuff? Like there's a lot of conversation. We need to have more civil discourse. And I think that's true. I think that's one thing that we can maybe focus on that's real close to home, right?
Yeah.
On an individual level. But do we need to get like really focused on electoral politics? Like what was the Queen's Alexandria something? Ocasio-Cortez. Yeah. She recently had a landslide victory over I think it was Crowley, who, you know, the super entrenched, super connected guy, and she won by like 15 or 20 points on a democratic socialist platform. And so is that part of the strategy here? Just nose to the grindstone democratic politics?
Well, I don't feel like I could advocate for violence. So that is something I just feel like I want to say. Yeah. And the other thing I want to say is that we have to be very careful about what we are doing when we do electoral politics, because let's be real, neither party is a solution. Mm-hmm. So when we engage in electoral politics, what are we doing?
Seems to be justifying the system as it is, or the parties as they are, right?
Right.
So, and that just makes me think of the work that you are doing, and the work that you keep talking about is this interpersonal, relational work, where it springs to my mind the essence of hope. You know, you have not optimism. You know, there's Cornwell talks about the difference between optimism and hope, where optimism is this idea that things will get better, just give it enough time, whereas hope is like, right. It's seeing that there might be something better in the face of catastrophe.
Right.
And I think that's important for me, that it comes from a person of color, because I think people of color, especially in this country, have been facing catastrophe for the entire history of this country.
Right.
And then to hear from you and other people of color that they still have hope, or that they're hoping for something better to come out of it, and to see the work that people of color have done in this country to make it a little bit better and moving the goalposts further down the line, it inspires me to do work in whatever fields or ways that I can do it. And
if I could just respond to that, I mean, I will be very honest that discovering who my audience is has been an eye-opener for me. So most of my audience, probably 90% of my audience, are white liberal progressives or progressive evangelicals, or those who have defected from evangelical churches. And I think that is really telling to me. Like, those are my people. I come from an evangelical tradition. And there's something really important about not leaving your people behind, even though many of them have perpetuated harm against me and my loved ones. I do embody a deep sense of hope, not to reform the system, but to revolutionize the system. And I ask people every day, are you called to be a charlatan, or are you called to be a revolutionary? Mm-hmm. And if you are called to be a charlatan, we are not going to be in good conversation. But if you're called to be a revolutionary, let's get to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's nonviolent revolution that you would advocate for? Absolutely. Yeah.
I think it would be worth sort of, and this may be a fantasy, Tad, but all fantasies aren't bad. I think it would be worth dreaming about having a convening and bringing people together to be in deeper conversation around these things. And I know the Activist Theology Project would love to host something like this and figure out how to bring people together and do this deep work. And, Tad, I'd love to do an event with you.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, no, and I'd be still like very interested to kind of hear more on what you mean by like restoring humanity, right? Because I get the sense that you're not just talking about like being nicer to people with vociferously cruel views, and I'd love to hear more about that because I think you're right. Like we live in this chaotic time where like maybe we won't have a civil war, but if we did, nobody would be that surprised. And sort of like the low grade violence is already happening, right? Like it's been 6 months since they passed like a tax cut bill that they knew would kill an additional 10,000 people per year, just by depriving them of health care, right? We are losing 250,000 people per year just from climate change, and that's going to ramp up to 500,000 in the next decade, right? Like the slow grade death is already going on, and it's been going on in communities of color for forever, right? So so we have this kind of like low grade civil war already going on, and the question I think like it always is quite concerning to like a revolution would be nice. It would be nice if things could go better and not be so fucking stupid, right? So as Lacan puts it, but at the same time, like we're not in a position where we can have like America 1776 again, right? Like that type like violent overthrow ends day one, right? Like the only hope is if like the military joins you in a coup, and I'm not counting on it, right? So yeah, I don't know where that goes. But like, and that's under the best circumstances, right? Where you have a civil war without any sort of larger breakdown in society and like end of supply chains and food and energy and all these other things, right? So like those cases all seem very, very dismal to me. But I don't know. Could you say more about like when you think about like restoring humanity to the other, like do you have like a specific like how does that look for you?
I mean, I'm
like
still
what
trying.
Are the strategies involved?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to figure it out. But I mean something more than civility. I mean something more than just learning to be civil with one another. I mean more than kindness. I mean more than being respectful or investing in respectability politics. When I think about restoring our humanity with one another, I think about what does it mean to be grounded in the center of our own difference and bridge with one another from that place. And I think this is complicated, very long work. It's relational work that I probably won't see before I die. But I feel like if we don't figure out how to build in how we innovate connection and belonging in these dire times, then we're not going to survive ourselves. That's sort of my diagnosis. The strategies on how we do that is I've not figured it out yet.
No, but I did like your idea earlier about convening some sort of larger not collective, but a larger group of people coming together, almost like it just reminded me of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or something along those lines, where people get together. Like we don't have those here. Maybe on smaller levels, maybe smaller groups, but on a larger level, like I think. I mean, I don't know if it's doable now. I mean, it'd be something to dream about. Again, it's another useful fantasy to push us on and push our work forward. But something along those lines actually would be interesting as a particular tool or instrument to maybe get people talking again to maybe bridge those ideological divides that we have in our country.
Right.
Because we've talked about walls and fear and anxiety, and I think ultimately the most barricaded person internally who is most ideologically violent or condemnatory of others or of the marginalized, I think that humans are ultimately porous, and even the most barricaded of us, even those of us with the largest walls on the inside.
Absolutely.
And I think that for me that gets into this notion of humanity. I know humanity can be defined variously, but I think there's still something relational, I think, about all creatures, and I think all creatures, including humanity, are still relational in some way, even if they're fencing off and creating borders around various borders around who's in and who's out, right? So
and let me just say that I am turning to biomimicry and permaculture to figure out and sort of learning from the wisdom of our elders in nature, learning, okay, well, what are strategies for resilience and healing that I can learn from nature, and how can we apply those strategies to humanity? So that's in part, Tad, a small piece of what I'm doing, turning to biomimicry and permaculture. And, we'd love to think with y'all about how to deploy these strategies. And, I feel like we should just have some sort of conference and do this work in public, but, and I'm just noticing the time, and I have another call that I need to jump on.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thanks for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great to be with y'all.
It was a lot of fun. Let's do it again.
Yep.
Do you have another minute, Tad?
Yeah, I can stay on for a few more minutes.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something Rama was just talking about, kind of thinking of the body, whether it's an individual body or collective body, as a sort of in an organismic sense, and right. And she's talking about learning lessons from nature, and I'm thinking about about the body's ability to resist disease. And I'm wondering if we can think about fascism as a particular kind of disease. And I know you've done some work around that area. How can we resist fascism if a direct approach is not kind of the way to go, only sort of irritates the issue more? How do we resist that disease?
Yeah, I don't know. And I say that like not just trying to be like intellectually humble, but I'm just not sure that it actually is something that we can resist, if not like a critical mass of people don't wish to resist that, right? Mm-hmm. One of the more concerning things about fascism is that it happens in a democracy, right? It doesn't happen in some sort of like starting totalitarian state. It needs a democracy, and it needs about 40%, right? It doesn't come to power with 51%, right? Like it needs a small. This is what Hannah Arendt, talks about. Like you have the leader and the masses and the mob, right? And you have to have a politically compliant masses, and you need a small group of core supporters that can kind of grow, but it doesn't need to get to 51%, right? And we live in that situation now where, like, even if we're just talking like kind of traditional conservative liberal politics, like already liberals need something like, I forget what it is, but it's something on the order of like more than 60% of the votes in order to have a majority in the House, right? Like it was just with our gerrymandering alone, right? Mm-hmm. But in our case now, like we've got so much voter suppression, gerrymandering, the money in politics issue. Like this just means that it's easier and easier for an extremist to come to power with just something like 40% support, right? So like Trump is right now like right on target for where he needs mm-hmm. to be to maintain power, right? Just judging from like the historical record, and it's it is a solution to a problem of economic anxiety, right? Like the reason that fascism springs up on the map in Europe and the places that it does, not just Italy and Germany, but in the half dozen or so proto-fascisms around the world. Like you look at what's going on in each one of them, there's a lot of economic anxiety, mostly sort of held over from the First World War. But that's going on, like, right? Like people are insecure. There's mass inflation. There is no plan B. There is not like a working social safety net. And so what do? Well, they turn to demonize the figure of the Jew, right? Or what other person that they didn't have enough interaction with that seemed like a scapegoat, right? And so it's concerning to me. And, like Adorno and Horkheimer in their book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, have that kind of discussion where they talk about mimetic desire and like the fascism, like hating in the other what he really hates in himself. But sort of the most foreboding line for me is like and that's the amazing thing, is that the lies are obvious and they persist. We don't live in a world where anyone is fooled about Trump, right? Like everyone knows he's a bullshitter. His supporters know that too, right? They're not stupid in that sense where they can't see the bullshit, right? Like the lie is obvious, but it persists, right? The lie can be enjoyed even if you know it's a lie. So I don't know. I didn't want to like keep rambling on there, unless like I didn't know if you had like a different direction you wanted to steer me. But yeah, no, I've been doing like a lot of work on Adorno, Hannah Arendt, Walter Benjamin, a more recent guy named Robert Paxton, who has kind of like a less radical but still like kind of very helpful program of understanding fascism. And all of that is very important to me right now, because we have this kind of also populism has traditionally been just a left-wing thing, right? And we never had like sort of a right-wing populism until maybe you could start talking about with like the McCarthy era in the 60s, right? Or like sort of a bit of that with the Tea Party push. But these types of things are now kind of evolving into like a very authoritarian desire, right? And the question is not whether or not the desire is there, it's just whether or not the competency will manifest that desire.
Yeah.
So it's a dangerous time, right?
Anything you want to plug or talk about what you're up to?
Yeah, I mean, I have an event in a few weeks, but you guys will probably have this out after that, I would imagine. But
yeah,
no, I mean, just you can find me. I'm pretty easy to find because my name is Tad Delay, and there's not that many of us, so you can find me on Twitter or Facebook or websites or whatever. And I'm really looking forward to getting the book on white evangelicalism out in the next maybe year or so, but it's still got a ways to go. So nothing specific really to plug right now.
Okay.
But I love connecting with people, so I'm pretty easy to find.
Very cool. All right, man. Well, enjoy the rest of your day. It was good talking with you.
Yeah, thanks, Ted.
All right. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right, bye. What do you think?
I liked his ability to kind of like analyze the psychological aspect of it and look at the dark side of the human features was really interesting, considering, because that's kind of like the trend that I go towards. I steer towards a little bit in my thinking, being a little bit more darkly cynical and pessimistic. Yeah. But then having Robyn talk, bring us back to this possibility of something more not positive, but something better, right? Something deeper, something more humane. I think having those two in conversation was really really good.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that I'm just really glad that we had them both on. I thought that was a good dynamic, and they bounced off each other well. And I appreciated how they kind of pressed each other in certain ways. I still feel like we didn't get too far in terms of what are we supposed to do.
Yeah, that's true.
And I was hoping for a little bit more of robust responses around that question. I think that maybe if those answers came too easily, we wouldn't even be asking the question, right? Because we're in difficult times.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately. I think Robyn also wanted a little bit more of. I mean, they seem to be kind of driving towards more practical aspects of like what we can do and what we can do now. Mm-hmm. And Robyn talked about how convening a conference or something like that might be a first step. Yeah. And I think that kind of speaks to what you're saying, that it's not an easy, and there are no real easy answers, and maybe a conference or a gathering or something of that sort would actually maybe be able to flesh out some of the responses. Because I mean, there are a lot of responses going on. There are a lot of people, fighting in the courts, fighting on the streets. I mean, Portland was just occupying an ICE building for about a week or more.
Yeah, I saw that.
It just got broken up. There are a lot of people doing, and not just with the immigration issue, there are a lot of people doing a lot. There are a lot of people with a lot of rods in the fire, right? A lot of different. Mm-hmm. There are just so many things to deal with right now. But I think ultimately, I left this conversation with a hope, with a more sense of an urgent hope.
Yeah.
I think it was helpful with what Robyn was saying. That Robyn has remained hopeful in the midst of catastrophe, and just reminding me of all of those teachers that I like, Latin American liberation theologians or Black liberation theologians. They're just people I would call prophets, who just push us forward and keep our eyes on the goal and do the work in the midst of the worst things that humanity can do to each other.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
But I think the first thing for me is to build people power, and do that like Robyn does with, or like they were saying about like interacting with people and bringing out of people their own resiliency and their own ability to have like power, and to recognize that they have power. So
right, and that power is inherently political, but not necessarily connected to politics as such.
I would say not politics in the way it's generally conceived, but everything for me is political in a lot of ways.
Sure. Yeah. I was just thinking back to the question of at what level we should place hope in electoral politics. I mean, she complicated it, right? It's like, well, we shouldn't put any hope in, and she didn't say this, but I'm reading between the lines, and maybe it's not right for me to do that, but don't put hope in the Democratic Party.
I think that could.
As I heard, and I get that. I get that. Like, the Democrats have been a problem. They've been selling out the American people while feeling their pain, for a long time. But like, what's the alternative? I mean, that is that just from a very practical, strategic. And maybe it's not just one thing. Maybe there's. Every movement has like multiple prongs, right? And so like let the violent revolutionary do their thing. Although,
but even within liberation theology, there were priests who turned over their priesthood and became revolutionaries, like Camilo Torres in Colombia. Like he was a priest and he saw what was going on and became a liberation theologian, then became an actual revolutionary and died in a gunfight. So like there are people like that too who are not necessarily passive resistors. They're actually violent resistors. So for me, like, I don't know.
And then you have like your Bonhoeffer example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Who was murdered for trying to get rid of Adolf Hitler. And I think I think he was justified in trying to get rid of Adolf Hitler, to be honest with you. Like, maybe that's a divisive point that I'm making, but I think that ultimately getting rid of, at that level in the 40s, and knowing and being somebody who's living in the country and knowing what's going on, I think that was a justifiable move. I mean, we have like, if you want to, because if you want to justify like a lot of progressives do, being a person in terms of the light of Jesus's message, witness, and ministry, like I don't see a lot of people going to their death like Jesus was going to it.
Right.
Like Jesus went to his death, resisting religious and imperial persecution. Yeah. So. But also, if you want to look at the Bible, it's a whole collection of documents about like, I mean, just look at what the example of God from like the Book of Exodus. He's killing people left and right. Like look at Joshua, where he tells people to go into the Canaan and the Promised Land and commit genocide to all these people. And these are a lot of reasons why people reject Christianity and the Bible as a source of inspiration and stuff like that. But I'm just saying that like the Bible and the Christian religion is more diverse than just simply peace-loving Jesus,
Yeah.
So, but I also get that we're called Christians.
Yeah. Right. And that to not really fully account for how complicated, how multivocal that collection of texts is, no matter what your hermeneutic is, right? If you presume there is a unity of meaning from the outset, then that can become fascistic.
Yeah, I agree. Because you're imposing a meaning on a multiplicity of texts and a multiplicity of voices. You're imposing one meaning on it.
Yeah, and you can do that.
What is more fascistic than that?
Yeah, and you can do that with the entire Bible, or you can do it with just the red letters. It doesn't matter.
Right. That's a good point.
So, I don't know, man. I wish Pete was able to jump on because that would have been awesome. But
yeah,
like he said this one thing not too long back about how violence is not a result of conflict. It's the unwillingness to have conflict.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of where I'm sitting right now, is how willing am I to be conflicted? You know what I mean?
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I heard him say that, what I get from that is this idea that since we're unable to actually talk with each other and like not aggressively, but I guess aggressively disagree with each other, but in a civilized, or in a way that we're not actually killing each other.
Yeah.
I think that's what I get from it, like where we can actually have disagreements, come to the same table and share a meal and completely disagree with each other. When that is foreclosed, I think for me, like the way I hear that statement is like when that is foreclosed, then physical violence ensues. And I think that's where we are in a lot of ways.
And I agree. And to put that next to what one of the things that Tad was saying is like one of the things that is assumed for that needs to happen to make that possible is that it's not just that we're willing to have a conversation, it's we're willing to have an honest conversation.
Right.
If you are coming to the table with arguments that you know full well are a lie, that these are verifiable things, you're making conversation and conflict impossible. You're kind of pressing us into a corner.